You are in the dark, undercroft, beneath a shattered curtain wall. The wind above the bailey still carries the clamor of horns and men. Below, stone holds the damp sleep of a ruined night. Something on the floor glints, an iron ring bolted into the wall, and the air tastes of smoke and stale bread. This is where the town's spoils were carried after the shouting stopped. What follows is not folklore or sensational rumor. This investigation argues that, after many medieval sieges, lords and their household administrations ran a routine, legal, economic, and spatial, by which captured women became pawns in systems of plunder, control, and coerced sexual use before some were ransomed, sold, or simply disappeared. I will lay out the documentary traces, the legal logics, and the archaeological signs that together make this pattern visible. Chronicles and clerical censures, household accounts and fiscal rolls, the physical layout of cellars and chained rings, and the human remains that bear witness. These lines of evidence do not tell every story. They reveal a structural practice too often minimized by romantic histories of chivalry. If this subject matters to you, please like and comment below. There is more archival reading and excavation reporting linked in the description, and this conversation benefits from careful attention. Legal and bureaucratic context, spoils, property, and the calculus of conquest. Medieval warfare was also an economy. Rulers and magnates expected material return from campaigns: cattle, grain, coin, and people. Contemporary legal vocabulary often treated captives as spoils, convertible into ransom, labor, or sale. This classification appears in a range of sources: secular chronicles that note the distribution of goods and captives after a sack, attested in multiple chroniclers of the 12th and 13th centuries, and in royal financial records, pipe rolls, and similar account books that record receipts from ransoms and the sale of prisoners. Archival holdings show entries for ransoms and fees. Scholars infer from these documentary strands that captives were economically processed, not merely incidentally abused. At the same time, the Church issued repeated censures against the pillage of church property and against sexual violence in war. Canonical texts and synodal legislation condemn rape and the mistreatment of non-combatants, attested in collections of canon law and in the writing of prominent bishops. But legal condemnation did not always translate into protection. Local custom, the needs of a household to feed retainers, and the bargaining power of an enterprising castellan could override ecclesiastical ideals. Thus, a paradox emerged. Normative law and moral rhetoric coexisted uneasily with an administrative practice that commodified captives. The documentary record is uneven and contested. Some later legal traditions, often mythologized, spectacularize a supposed right of lords to the bodies of conquered women. Modern historians have largely discredited the idea of a formal, universal droit du seigneur as a codified privilege. The strongest, most defensible claim is different. Captives were treated as spoils within a feudal economy, and where oversight was weak, that status left them vulnerable to sexual exploitation. To substantiate that interpretive move requires comparing literary denunciations with material traces. Chroniclers' outraged passages plus physical spaces in which captives were kept. Literary sources: chroniclers, clerics, and the language of outrage. Medieval chroniclers do not always speak with a single voice, but several voices converge on scenes of atrocity after sieges. Campaign narratives, whether of the Iberian Reconquista, the Norman conquests, or the crusading expeditions, frequently contain strained passages where writers confess shock at what followed the storming of walls. For example, crusade narratives record episodes of mass pillage and the sexual abuse of the vanquished, attested in the chronicles of the First Crusade and other contemporary accounts. Continental annals and local hagiographies recount bishops who protested the sight of women paraded or abused, or who set up hospices for those left destitute by sack. These accounts are rhetorical. Chroniclers often write to shame or to moralize, and their tone can exaggerate. Still, their recurring pattern matters. Where hostile acts appear across independent sources and in different regions, historians infer a real, repeated practice. Clerical writers and legal commentaries add a second voice, less lurid but more juridical, cataloging the sin, calling for penance, and sometimes demanding restitution or the payment of fines. The combination of sensational narrative and clerical rebuke establishes a documentary baseline. The mistreatment of captive women was both frequent enough to be noticed and morally problematic enough to attract condemnation. Logistics and procedure, from ramparts to cellar to ledger. If captives were treated as spoils, there followed a routine: capture, collection, holding, adjudication or distribution, and either ransom, sale, or retention. Chroniclers and household manuals sketch fragments of this chain. Administrative records sometimes make it explicit. Castles and fortified manors had routines for inventory and goods. Victuals and livestock were logged, and at times payments for ransoms appear in the ledgers. Scholars infer from such entries that women and children could be recorded alongside other items in the household economics of a lord. The physical infrastructure supported that process. Many fortifications include spaces expressly suited to holding people: small vaulted rooms beneath halls, narrow chambers off service passages, and storerooms with heavy doors. Archaeology shows that some of these spaces were not mere storage, but equipped for confinement. Iron rings set into stone, evidence of door fittings, and scratches on plaster consistent with repeated use and restraint. Excavators report chained rings and anchor points in a number of urban and rural sites, finds that are described as consistent with restraining animals or goods, but which, within a context of siege and captive processing, acquire a different valence. Such material features do not, on their own, prove a program of sexual exploitation. Combined with documentary records noting the distribution of captives and with chroniclers' reports of abuse, they strengthen an interpretation of systematic processing. Consider how a lord's household might have handled arrivals after a sack. Men valuable as ransom could be separated and counted. Children were often appropriated as labor or fostered. Women's fates were variable and highly contingent. A castellan needed to decide quickly who would be kept for service, who would be offered to retainers, who would be prepared for market sale, who would be ransomed. Household stewards, those who managed the larders and ledgers, left traces in account rolls and instructions: orders for extra blankets, payments for escorts to the market, allocations of clothing and bedding. Those administrative traces appear intermittently in estate records and miscellaneous, and historians read them together to reconstruct the bureaucratic logic that could enable sexual predation. Archaeology corroborates the procedural picture in different ways. At sites where occupation layers date to periods of warfare, excavators have unearthed concentrations of domestic refuse and personal items, broken combs, fragments of bodices, pins, that suggest the hurried stripping and relocation of households. Nearby, small barred chambers and vaults sometimes contain assemblages of objects that imply temporary confinement. Human skeletal remains from battle-affected cemeteries display trauma inconsistent with combat alone, healed injuries suggesting captivity, and perimortem signs that indicate violence. Bioarchaeologists and osteologists have argued in careful, hedged publications that patterns of injury and deposition in certain contexts are consistent with treatment as prisoners rather than as fallen combatants. When chroniclers and material remains point in the same direction, an interpretive claim gains force. The household conversation, a reconstruction to convey procedure. Bring them below. Record names, ages if you can. The steward would have ordered, and the castellan sergeant would have barked to the men haul in cloaks and chests. Who gets the pregnant woman? A younger squire might have asked. And the answer came as an administrative. Keep her in the tower cellar. We will ask the Lord. This exchange is an imaginative reconstruction grounded in the patterns visible in household ordinances and chronicled distributions. It is not a verbatim transcript, but stands to make tangible the decisions that paperwork and architecture record. Markets, auctions, and the economy of bodies. Beyond the immediate household, medieval markets played a role in processing captives. Port towns and market fairs were nodes through which people could be sold, transferred, or ransomed. Legal records occasionally survive of sales of captives, though such entries are fragmentary and often anonymized in municipal records or toll registers. Marketplace regulation sometimes addressed the trade in people, as urban authorities regulated foreign merchants and kept registers for tolls. Archaeologists studying marketplaces find deposits of diverse goods and, in some stratigraphic contexts associated with conflict, sudden influxes of items that correspond to periods of sack and displacement. Where marketplaces intersected with sexual exploitation, the documentary evidence becomes darker and more fragmentary. Ecclesiastical court records include cases brought by women who escaped or whose families sought restitution. Some pastoral manuals admonish priests to counsel and aid women vulnerable after raids. These documents suggest that sex as spoil was not merely spontaneous, but could become institutionalized when local economies and military codes tacitly permitted it. Again, the evidence is uneven and regionally variable. In some regions, ecclesiastical protection and strong civic oversight curtailed such practices, while in weakly governed zones, the abuses proliferated. Material traces of markets and brothels overlap archaeologically in towns where legal brothels were tolerated. Rooms for sex work with benches and door fittings appear in urban excavations, sometimes adjacent to thoroughfares associated with trading. In occupied towns, the co-presence of such rooms and of evidence for captive influx creates a historical pressure point where commerce and coercion meet. Literary denunciations and municipal ordinances together create a mosaic. Sale, transfer, and forced sexual service could be components of the same local economy. Social dynamics, knights, retainers, and the choreography of reward. Medieval military culture valorized martial prowess and distributed spoils as reward. A lord's men expected remuneration for risk: land, livestock, coin, and occasionally servants. The celebrity of a knight, his tales, his arms, coexisted with dependence on his lord's largesse. In that environment, the sexual use of captured women could become a form of patronal reward. Chroniclers describe the distribution of prisoners to followers after some campaigns. Where these distributions occurred, ecclesiastical writers often recorded their disapproval. This dynamic created a moral tension. Honor codes and chivalric rhetoric, idealized in later literature, proclaimed protection of the weak, even while practical norms allowed or ignored abuse. Some lords regulated the behavior of their men, others turned a blind eye or actively participated. Household ordinances, when preserved, sometimes show an attempt at control: fines for desertion, stipends for victuals, instructions about ransoms. But ordinances rarely mention sexual conduct explicitly. Constraints, if present, were often enforced informally or not at all. Humanization without sensationalism, reconstructing experience. Grounding empathy in evidence requires restraint. We cannot fabricate names or testimonies for most of those who suffered. Instead, we reconstruct probable experience with modal language and sensory detail anchored in the material record. Imagine the woman in that undercroft. The torches above flicker as men stagger home, the crowd's laughter muffled by stone. She would have smelled smoke and wet wool. She would have felt the grit of the floor beneath her feet and the cold iron of a ring if it met her wrist. She would have heard the creak of the household's gear, ropes, pulleys, the hush of officials moving lists and cloaks. Osteological studies suggest that people taken in raids sometimes endured repeated labor, nutritional stress, and trauma. Burial patterns in certain cemeteries show anomalous deposition consistent with marginalization. Such bioarchaeological evidence cannot tell us what a given person felt, but it does give a physiological outline of what captivity often entailed: constrained movement, physical deprivation, and the heightened risk of sexual violence. When sources have preserved names, rare inscriptions, occasional charters where a woman is later ransomed by kin, they offer partial voices. These fragments, when present in archival holdings, are invaluable precisely because they are scarce. Scholars piece them together with ritual and legal documents to model likely fates: ransom negotiated through intermediaries, the payment recorded in a chapel ledger, the woman's name appearing as a debtor or beneficiary. Each of these traces restores a sliver of agency amid otherwise administrative erasure. Institutional continuity and the shifts that followed. This system did not remain static. Several forces intersected over centuries to change the patterns of post-siege behavior. The consolidation of stronger central authorities in some polities made rent-seeking by local lords harder. The growing importance of ransom as a profitable and repeatable income stream incentivized keeping valuable captives alive and literate negotiation over outright dispossession. Simultaneously, persistent ecclesiastical pressure, sermons, councils, and the threat of excommunication created moral and sometimes legal constraints that could, in pockets, reduce overt sexual predation. Archaeological sequences show that in some regions, the structures used for temporary confinement were repurposed or fell out of use as late medieval households professionalized. Yet, institutional change was uneven. In frontier zones or in wartime conditions where authority weakened, the old patterns persisted. Chroniclers in later centuries still record outbreaks of predation following siege incidents, and local jurisprudence often reacted too slowly to be preventative. The decline of one set of practices sometimes corresponded to the emergence of others. Where rape and forced use were curtailed, trafficking in women as domestic servants or in child labor increased, and the ledger's logic of conversion from person to commodity remained operative in new forms. Climax, where architecture, account, and chronicle converge. The moral recognition this pattern requires emerges when at least two independent evidentiary strands intersect in a single context. Take an instance where an excavation uncovers a subfloor chamber with iron anchor points and the spatial signs of confinement, where nearby grave deposits show unusual patterns of trauma, and where local archival sources, household accounts, or municipal rolls register payments for ransoms or entries for captives in the run of inventories. When those elements cohere, the historian can move beyond accusation to reasoned claim. The built environment, the bones, and the paperwork together indicate institutional processing of captives and create a high probability that some of those captives experienced sexual violence as part of their enforced commodification. Such convergences are not universal, but where they appear, they force a re-evaluation of how we read castles and chronicles. The stones of a keep do not merely witness glory. They also record the routines of containment. Ledgers reduce human lives to columns and entries. Chronicles supply the moral heat, the physical record supplies corroboration. Resolution, memory, monuments, and ethical reckoning. Modern fascination with castles, tournaments, and chivalric romance has a cost. It often sanitizes the machinery of violence that made aristocratic power possible. To look without blinking at the full record is not to indulge in macabre curiosity, but to restore a fuller moral history. The evidence, legal categories that treated captives as spoils, chroniclers who denounced abuses, household accounts that itemized ransoms and distributions, and archaeologists who uncover spaces consistent with confinement, shows an administrative, not merely accidental pattern. What should be done with that knowledge? Practically, there are several avenues. Scholars can prioritize integrated publication, tying archaeological reports to archival transcriptions and to careful reading of chronicles so that future audiences see the connective tissue. Museum displays and heritage narratives can present castles and sieges in their double register, public spectacle above, processes of containment below, rather than allowing one story to eclipse the other. Public commemorations might recognize victims of medieval conflict alongside celebrants of martial achievement. The ledgers exist. Archival holdings include ransom receipts and household accounts. The stones still bear marks. These are accessible starting points for further investigation. Final appeal and call to engagement. If this reconstruction has unsettled you, that feeling is the point. History should complicate comfortable myths. If you want to go further, follow the linked reading list for excavation reports and edited household accounts. Consult the compilations of canon law that record episcopal responses, and look at regional studies of siege archaeology. Share this piece, subscribe for further investigations into the hidden infrastructures of power, and leave a comment about what surprised you most. These discussions help shape public awareness and encourage museums and archives to place these materials where they can be studied openly. The stones remember. Reading their traces responsibly is a moral work we can choose to continue. What might practical collaboration look like on the ground? First, teams must design projects from the outset as multi-evidentiary inquiries rather than as sequential handovers. Excavators should budget and plan for sustained archival work. Archivists should plan for material culture specialists to consult ledgers and inventories. Osteologists should be briefed on documentary expectations, and historians of law and liturgy should be invited to read chronicles and canon sources in parallel. When all four modalities, stone, bone, ink, and narrative, are treated as equally provisional pieces of a single argument, the questions we ask change. We start to look for processes rather than singular events. Patterns of confinement recurring across households. The routine language of accounting that normalizes captive status. The architectural features that are replicable across regions, and the episcopal or municipal responses that register moral unease without necessarily rectifying practice. Second, ethical frameworks must be explicit and shared. Excavation teams encountering human remains in contexts suggestive of captivity need protocols for immediate assessment, respectful handling, and consultation with relevant stakeholders. Local communities, descendant groups where identifiable, and scholars with appropriate specialty. Where remains are to be retained for study, clear timeframes for analysis and reburial, or for permanent curation with sensitive access conditions should be agreed in writing. Museum displays that include such finds must avoid voyeuristic presentation. Labels should explain both the material facts and the interpretive limits, and should foreground the humanity of those represented rather than reducing them to exemplars of a thesis. Third, publication practices should change. Integrated reports, those that publish archaeological stratigraphy, osteological tables, transcribed household accounts, and edited chronicle excerpts together, should be the norm rather than the exception. Peer review panels for such publications must be assembled from multiple disciplines so that claims about sexual violence, captivity, or institutional processing are scrutinized from all relevant angles. Digital platforms make this feasible. Linked data systems can allow a reader to move from an image of an anchor point to the ledger entry from the same household to an osteological inventory that lists perimortem trauma. That transparency both strengthens argument and allows others to contest or refine interpretation. Fourth, museums and heritage sites should revise narratives of martial glory. Castle tours, reenactments, and exhibition texts can maintain the spectacle that draws publics while inserting countervailing stories about containment, administration, and human cost. Practical steps include interpretive plaques at specific architectural features explaining possible functions and the evidence for containment, dedicated display cases for household account books with translation and commentary, and guided micro-exhibitions that present a case study from stone to script to skeleton. Public programming, lectures, school curricula, and participatory workshops can model how to hold both admiration for craft and critique of coercion. Fifth, archives must be made more accessible and more legible. Many household accounts remain in manuscript form, unreadable to all but paleographers. Funded initiatives to transcribe, translate, and publish these records, ideally with open access licenses, would democratize the primary sources that demonstrate how captives were recorded. Critical editorial work must annotate terms of art, the taxonomies that converted people into commodities, explain fiscal practices, and situate entries within wider legal and cultural norms. Sixth, pedagogy matters. Teaching medieval history at undergraduate and public levels should include modules on methodology as moral practice, how the historian's choices shape what is remembered. Assignments that require students to work across corpora, matching an archaeological plan to a ledger entry to a chronicle passage, train a new generation to think in connections. They also cultivate humility about the limits of the evidence and responsibility toward the subjects of study. Finally, there is a policy dimension. Funders and university departments should reward interdisciplinary work on difficult subjects, not penalize it for its messiness. Heritage bodies should support conservation that recognizes the full history of a site, including its uses for confinement and control, and local governments should be encouraged to fund commemorative initiatives that acknowledge victims as well as victors. None of this is quick or easy. It requires institutional patience, additional resources, and a willingness to unsettle established narratives that have long served identity, tourism, and scholarly prestige. But the alternative is to allow selective amnesia to persist, to keep celebrating stonework and ceremony while the ledger's columns remain unread and the marks of confinement on floors unremarked. What can readers and practitioners do now? Scholars can begin small. Pair an undergraduate practicum with a local archive. Invite an osteologist to a seminar on household records. Pilot a digital dossier that links excavation reports to transcriptions. Curators can audit their labels for omission and think about where a single sentence acknowledging forced containment would alter public understanding. Funders can prioritize projects that promise genuine integration over those promising tidy, disciplinary deliverables. And all of us can accept that the pleasures of medieval material culture must be held in tension with the moral obligations that come with new knowledge. The stones and the ledgers will not speak clearly by themselves. They need attentive reading. When we listen with care to accounts written for accountants, to chronicles written with rhetorical purpose, to human bones that bear the traces of life constrained, we are undertaking an ethical practice as much as an intellectual one. That practice alters both scholarship and public memory. It asks of us a readiness to complicate comfort, to place victims visibly at the center of narrative, and to design institutions of care that can steward evidence responsibly. The work is slow, but it is necessary. To see fully is to be obliged to remember fully, and to remember honestly is to allow the past to shape a more accountable present.